and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. U.S. President Trump says Iran has agreed to almost all his terms to halt its nuclear weapons program, with final negotiations expected to resume this weekend as the current ceasefire deadline looms next week. Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire brokered by Trump. But with Israeli troops staying in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah's weapons unresolved and a history of failed truces, lasting peace remains far from guaranteed. Britain and France are co-hosting an international summit on Friday with around 40 nations, including South Korea, to establish a multinational defensive mission to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with the U.S. notably absent. U.S. President Donald Trump claims a comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran is imminent. This comes as the U.S. House narrowly rejected a resolution to halt military strikes in the region. Kim Do-yeon reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump says a comprehensive agreement with Iran is within reach, claiming Tehran has agreed to almost all American terms to halt its nuclear weapons program. Speaking to reporters on Thursday local time, Trump stated that the two sides are close to finalizing a deal to end the conflict.
We had to make sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And we're at that. They've agreed to that. They've totally agreed to that. They've agreed to almost everything.
Negotiations are expected to resume this weekend, with Trump naming Islamabad, Pakistan as a potential venue to finalize the agreement.
I would go to Pakistan, yeah. Pakistan has been great. They've been so good. Islamabad, I might go, yeah.
While projecting optimism on the diplomatic front, the U.S. president publicly criticized Pope Leo XIV regarding the ongoing crisis. Trump claimed the pontiff supports Tehran possessing a nuclear weapon, a statement the Vatican has not made, using the assertion to defend his administration's hardline approach.
I'm not fighting with him. The Pope made a statement. He says Iran can have a nuclear weapon. I say Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if the Pope looked at the 42,000 people that were killed over the last 2 or 3 months as a protester with no weapons, no nothing, I mean, you take a look at that. So I can disagree with the Pope. I have a right to disagree with the Pope.
Domestically, the Trump administration cleared a major legislative hurdle to maintain its current military posture. The U.S. House of Representatives narrowly rejected a war powers resolution designed to force a halt to U.S. military strikes against Iran. The Democrat-led measure failed in a 214 to 213 vote, allowing current operations to continue without congressional interference as the administration pursues a final negotiated settlement. The ongoing ceasefire, in an attempt to come to an agreement between the U.S. and Iran, will end next Wednesday. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire following 6 weeks of fighting between Israeli forces and Hezbollah. But with Israeli troops set to remain in southern Lebanon and key conditions unresolved, questions remain over how long the truce will hold. Lee Seung-jae has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Thursday that Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire after 6 weeks of fighting between Israeli forces and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed Israel's participation, but said troops will remain in a 10-kilometer security zone in southern Lebanon, signaling no immediate withdrawal during the truce.
I agreed to a pause, or more accurately, to a temporary ceasefire of 10 days, to try to move forward with the agreement we began discussing during the ambassadors' meeting in Washington.
Hezbollah expressed conditional support, saying any ceasefire must include a complete halt to attacks across Lebanon and no freedom of movement for Israeli forces. The group warned that any continued military presence would justify armed resistance. The conflict began in early March following joint U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, which prompted Hezbollah to launch rockets into northern Israel. Since then, more than 2,000 people in Lebanon have been killed, over 1 million displaced, and tens of thousands of homes damaged or destroyed. Israel reports limited civilian casualties, but confirmed military losses in the fighting. In the hours before the ceasefire, both sides continued cross-border strikes. Rare direct talks were also held in Washington, with Trump proposing a future White House meeting with Netanyahu and Lebanese President Joseph Aoun. However, major issues remain unresolved, especially the future of Hezbollah's weapons. Lebanese officials say disarmament cannot be forced and must come through negotiation, raising doubts about whether the ceasefire will lead to lasting peace. Previous ceasefires between Israel and Hezbollah have failed to hold, with clashes continuing even after agreements took effect, suggesting this truce may offer only a temporary pause in the conflict. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
President Lee Jae-myung is set to attend a virtual meeting led by the UK and France over freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. A senior Blue House official said on Thursday that free and safe passage in Hormuz serves the interests of all parties and is crucial to Korea's national interests. The international talks are set to take place late Friday, Korea time. President Lee is expected to send a message on energy supply and his whole stance on the Middle East situation. More than 70 entities have reportedly been invited, including international organizations. And with an Israel-Lebanon ceasefire now in effect and U.S. Iran nuclear talks set to resume this weekend, the Middle East is at a critical juncture. But the question is whether these fragile developments can hold. For more, we're joined by Baek Seung-un, researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me to your show.
So a 10-day ceasefire has just gone into effect between Lebanon and Israel. And how do you think this affects the bigger picture between the U.S. and Iran?
Yes, the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire is certainly meaningful, but mainly as a secondary variable rather than the decisive one. What it does, above all, is lower the immediate risk of regional spillover through Hezbollah and created a slightly less combustible strategic environment. That in turn gives Washington more diplomatic bandwidth to concentrate on the central issues, which remains the U.S.-Iran track. So in that sense, the ceasefire is helpful because it stabilizes one front and creates some political space for broader diplomacy. But we should not overstate its significance. It does not resolve the core dispute. So the real point of contention are still Iran's nuclear program, the futures of the Strait Hormuz and sanctions relief, and the question of what kind of security guarantees either side is prepared to accept. So I would say this ceasefire is strategically useful, but not strategically decisive. So if it holds, it could improve the atmospheres for negotiation. If it collapses, it could certainly complicate them. But ultimately, a U.S.-Iran understanding will depend not on the southern Lebanon, but on whether Washington and Tehran can narrow their differences on enrichment, highly enrichment uranium stockpiles, and the sequencing of sanction relief and de-escalation.
Right, and U.S. President Trump said that negotiations with Iran might take place in person over the weekend, and talks mediated by Pakistan are continuing. And do you think a deal is actually realistic before the ceasefire expires next week, or are we more likely looking at another breakdown?
I mean, a limited deal is realistic. A comprehensive deal before the ceasefire expires is too much less so. So at this stage, the diplomatic signal suggests that both sides are at least willing to explore whether a short-term arrangement is possible. Pakistani mediation appears to have helped keep channel open, and the public messaging from Washington suggests a desire to translate military pressure into some form of political outcome. But the underlying disagreement remains substantial, especially on the nuclear issues and the conditions surrounding maritime access and Strait of Hormuz. Yes, but there was a kind of like good mood because after the ceasefire of Lebanon and Israel, so there was a certain like good gestures of Iran that they were going to let through the Oman maritime area to actually let the Hormuz flow keep on going. So the most plausible outcome in the near term is not a grand bargaining, but an interim understanding, something narrower, more tactical, and more reversible. So that could mean an extension of the ceasefire, limited nuclear restraint by Iran, and some formula regarding enrichment of uranium, and perhaps a partial sanction or financial relief mechanism. So in other words, something that buys time, lower the temperatures, and allows both sides to claim progress without yet resolving the deepest disagreement. So yes, some form of agreement is possible before next week, but I think the more realistic expectation is a bridging arrangement rather than a final whole grand bargaining settlement.
Right, and you mentioned the nuclear issue just now, and this does appear to be the biggest sticking point. Is there a realistic middle ground here, or do you think this is a fundamental incompatibility that could sink the entire deal?
I mean, there's a possible middle ground, but yes, it is quite narrow and politically very difficult. But like the most realistic compromise is not total dismantlement on the one hand or unrestricted enrichment on the other. Rather, it would like take a form of limited time-bound framework, like freeze of nuclear enrichment, so caps on enrichment levels, strict verification and monitoring, and some mechanism for reducing or exporting at least part of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile. But it is out from Trump administration. But there are certain like argument that Iran will gonna send all their stockpile outside of their Iranian border. So if that happens, yeah, definitely there will going to be a middle ground could be created. So in exchange for phase and conditional sanction relief, yeah, there's a lot of like option that kind of built and strengthen the middle ground. And technically, that kind of formula is conceivable. The real problem is that the disagreement is not merely technical; it is also deeply political and strategic. So Washington wants credible assurance that Iran cannot move rapidly toward weaponization. Tehran, meanwhile, wants recognition of its sovereign nuclear right. So, like tangible sanction relief and some confidence that diplomacy will not simply be followed by renewed coercion. So this is not just an arms control negotiation. It is also a negotiation about trust, sequencing, and political intent. That is precisely why the middle ground exists in theory, but is so difficult to sustain in practice. But I would not yet call it fundamentally incompatible, because like what I said, there are certain like element and certain variable, certain package that we're going to bring, enlarge and strengthening the middle ground.
Right, and going into some other factors that are weighing in on this possible deal, do you think the U.S. naval blockade pressure will, force Iran into a deal, or does it risk escalating the situation beyond the point where diplomacy can still work?
In truth, it does both. So on the one hand, the naval blockade clearly increased pressure on Iran. It raises the economic cost of continued defiance, constrains Iran's room for maneuver, and strengthens Washington's bargaining position. From a coercive diplomacy perspective, it is meant to signal that time is not on Tehran's side. But pressure and diplomacy do not always move in parallel. The more expensive and prolonged blockade becomes, the greater risk of miscalculation, confrontation at sea, and the cycle of escalation in which both sides feel compelled to demonstrate resolve rather than flexibility. So, and once that dynamic takes hold, diplomacy becomes much harder because concession begins to look like weakness rather than strategy. So the blockade may help bring Iran to the table, but it cannot by itself produce a durable agreement. So I think I hope this could be the answer to your question, but I do believe it does both.
All right, thank you so much for your insight today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
President Lee Jae-myung will be departing on state visits to India and Vietnam this weekend. Energy security is expected to be high on the agenda during his summits with the leaders of the two countries. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min takes a closer look at what's on the agenda.
Starting Sunday, the South Korean president will embark on a two-nation week-long trip to other countries in Asia. His itinerary will first take him to India, where he will meet with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Monday for a summit, involving expanded talks, exchange of MOUs, and a joint press conference. The leaders are set to discuss cooperation in the areas of trade, shipbuilding, AI, the defense industry, and culture, on top of energy supplies amid the Middle East conflict.
As a leading country in the global south and a fast-growing country, India is a key partner as we extend our pragmatic diplomacy centered on the national interest.
Yi will be hosted by Modi for lunch. Last year, the two leaders met on the sidelines of the G7 and G20 summits. On Tuesday, Yi will arrive in Hanoi, and the next day, he will sit down with To Lam, Vietnam's top leader and general secretary of the Communist Party. The summit will include the signing of MOUs, a joint press conference, and a state dinner. High on the agenda is cooperation in trade, energy supplies, critical minerals, and culture.
Following General Secretary To Lam's visit to Korea last year as President Yi's first state guest, President Yi will be the first state guest to be hosted by Vietnam's new leadership. It is expected to be a new turning point for a co-prosperity vision and the future of the two countries.
On Thursday, the South Korean leader will meet Vietnamese Prime Minister Lee Min-hung and National Assembly Chairman Chen Tain-man, respectively ranked number 2 and number 3 in the country's power structure. During his trips to India and Vietnam, President Yi will also meet business leaders and Koreans living in those countries. He will return home on Friday. After hosting several foreign leaders this month, including those from Europe, President Yi will head to Asia as he extends his diplomatic outreach amid a crucial time in geopolitics. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
An official from the International Monetary Fund said Thursday that South Korea has substantial energy buffers but remains exposed to supply shocks from the Middle East conflict. Speaking at a regional economic outlook briefing, IMF official Thomas Helbling noted that Seoul has taken proactive steps to cushion the impact, including securing reserves and diversifying energy sources, even as disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz continue to threaten global shipments. Still, he warns that South Korea shares a broader regional vulnerability as a major energy importer, leaving it sensitive to rising oil and gas prices. The ongoing U.S.-Israeli war against Iran has already pushed energy costs up, fueling inflation concerns and increasing the levels of risk for Asia's import-dependent economies, including South Korea. April 16th marked the 12th anniversary of the Sewol ferry disaster, which claimed more than 300 lives. President Lee Jae-myung attended the memorial service on Thursday afternoon, becoming the first sitting president to do so. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yu-jin reports.
기억하겠습니다. 잊지 않겠습니다.
More than a decade after one of South Korea's biggest tragedies, a sitting president has finally taken part in its annual memorial. President Lee Jae-myung and First Lady Kim Hae-kyung attended the Sewol ferry disaster memorial service on Thursday in Ansan, Gyeonggi-do Province.
매년 이맘때만 되면 말로 다 담아내기 어려운 마음과 마주하게 됩니다.
304 people, most of them students from Townon High School in Ansan, died after the passenger ferry capsized off South Korea's southwestern coast on April 16, 2014. Overloading and delayed rescue efforts have been cited as key factors behind the scale of the disaster. Acknowledging a heavy sense of responsibility as head of state, Lee vowed to build a country that lives up to its fundamental role of protecting its people.
생명과 안전에 관해서는 단 한치의 빈틈도 허용하지 않겠습니다. 이 약속을 지키는 것이야말로 세월호가 우리에게 남긴 숙제를 완성하는 길이라고 확신합니다.
The Blue House described President Yee's attendance as a commitment to strengthening state responsibility for social disasters and restoring public trust. The absences of his predecessors over the years were widely seen as reflecting political sensitivities and concerns over potential backlashes at the memorial. Bereaved families welcomed President Yee's participation, calling it a meaningful gesture of comfort, but stressed that action must follow.
In not only the Sewol ferry disaster, but other social tragedies as well, the government must step in first to protect the rights of victims before they are forced to demand accountability, punishment, and prevention measures.
Families have continued to call for a full account of the government's initial response, including late reporting of the disaster to the presidential office. They've also raised concerns over a lack of accountability, pointing to acquittals and pardons involving some officials. 송유진, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Russia launched its deadliest attack on Ukraine this year overnight on Wednesday, killing at least 17 people. The massive wave of drone and missile strikes across Kyiv, Odessa, and Dnipro also left more than 100 people wounded. In Kyiv, a drone slammed into an 18-storied apartment building in the early morning hours. 4 people died in the capital, 8 in Odessa, where a high-rise residential building took a direct hit, and 4 more in Dnipro, where Russian strikes set residential buildings ablaze. Rescue operations were still ongoing Thursday, with officials warning the toll could rise. Ukraine struck back at Russia, hitting 2 oil depots in Crimea and a major oil refinery port on the Black Sea. President Zelensky said the attack proved Russia deserves no easing of sanctions and called on the international community to deliver every promised package of military assistance without delay. The White House is moving to give federal agencies access to Anthropic's most powerful and closely guarded AI model, Mythos, even as senior officials warn the tool could dramatically increase cybersecurity risk if it falls into the wrong hands. The White House Office of Management and Budget told officials at the Pentagon, Treasury, Justice Department, and other top agencies on Tuesday that safeguards are being put in place, with more details in the coming weeks. Anthropic has so far limited Mythos to a small group of technology and financial firms after internal testing showed the model could uncover the kind of critical software vulnerabilities that only the world's best hackers could find. Europe has roughly 6 weeks of jet fuel left. That's according to the head of the International Energy Agency on Thursday, who warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remained blocked, flight cancellations could begin soon. Calling the current situation the largest energy crisis the world has ever faced, the IEA chief said that without a permanent reopening of the waterway by end of May, countries could slide toward recession. He added that even with a peace deal, war damage to the region's energy facilities could take up to 2 years to fully repair. 6 days after splashing down in the Pacific, the Artemis II crew faced the cameras in Houston on Thursday and said that a landing on the moon is closer than people think. Mission Commander Reed Wiseman said if a lunar lander had been aboard, at least 3 of his crewmates would have tried to land on the moon right then and there. Wiseman called the next step technically challenging, but absolutely doable and coming soon.
If the past few days felt more like June than April, today presses pause. We had cloudy skies to start out this morning, and many southern areas will see rain today. In fact, rain is already falling across Jeollanam-do province and Jeju Island, and it will reach Chungcheong-do province by the afternoon. Jeju Island could see up to 80 millimeters of downpours along with thunderstorms. Jeollanam-do and Gyeongsang-nam-do province could see 20 to 60 millimeters through tomorrow. But up in the capital area, we'll be under cloudy skies today. And today's cool down will not last long. Inland areas will turn mostly sunny this weekend, and temperatures will rise again. By Sunday, Seoul will be getting up to 28 degrees Celsius. But as for this afternoon, Seoul will make it to 21 degrees. Daegu only gets up to 18 degrees Celsius. And unlike this week, next next week looks closer to season norms under mostly sunny skies.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.